Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, Star Wars, Star Trek, Battletech, Shadowrun. You pick the setting, but ask yourselves this. What do the Ferengi Alliance, the Imperial Remnant, the Duchy of Orlov and the Council of Princes all have in common? Well, if it isn't obvious, they are all ruled by an oligarchy. Now, do you need to know what an oligarchy is when world building? Honestly, I believe it helps tremendously if you do, so I invite you to stick around, have a cup of something tasty, and I will give you a very short version of what you need to know in order to take your world building to the next level. Hello all you wonderfully funky people, Funky Monkey here. Welcome to today's episode of Funky Monkey MP. I have Potato here who is joining me in telling you what oligarchs are. So let's start digging through history, shall we? To better help you understand what an oligarchy is, I propose to first start with telling you why you should have one in your world, or at least one. Oligarchies offer a lot of opportunities, regardless if you run a darker setting or a happy-go-lucky one. It allows you as a world builder to create a very strong representation of how wealth and power corrupts even the most well-intended of individuals. They can be a source of discontent among the commoners and can be a catalyst for a revolution, or can be the tragic result of trust being placed in the wrong people who have charisma at max level. Or of course, it can be something to be removed so that an age of healing, reconstruction and prosperity can begin. Such a political construct can even be used so that the players in your world have a great start in their careers, doing not so pleasant things for coin, but nothing outrageous, only to then turn around and overthrow those who squeeze the life out of the realm, leading to an perhaps awesome redemption arc. Your imagination is the only limit. With that established, what is an oligarchy? According to Merriam-Webster dictionary, an oligarchy is a form of government in which a very small group of individuals exercise control, especially for corrupt and selfish purposes. The key here is the corruption that characterizes such governmental organizations. What is the origin of oligarchies? The term oligarch or oligarchy originates in ancient Greece and it means ruled by few, and ever since ancient times the term has had a connotation that is not that good, and rightfully so. As you might imagine, as long as there have been people trading for goods, any goods, there have been individuals who try to exploit their dominance, first impose their dominance and then exploit it over a certain sector of the market or over certain resources. As such, the origin of the oligarchs is as ancient as humanity itself, and over most of our history, let's be honest, as a species, we've been plagued with such individuals. Throughout history, oligarchs have always been there, but to a certain extent, they've been kept in check. Nowadays, it's easy to spot them, and there are several states that are full-blown oligarchies and are characterized by chronic corruption. And there are several great examples, but we'll get to that in a bit. Forms of oligarchy. The simplest way of understanding the different types of oligarchies is by identifying what is the means of absolute control employed. It might be through controlling resources such as food and energy, oil, gas, even medication. It may be through the control of businesses in general, or even through religion. At the beginning of the 20th century, an idea has been put forward, one of intellectual oligarchy, where specialists, doctors, professors, lawyers, engineers, and politicians would rule a country and the common folk would suffer. So, these intellectuals should be overthrown and simple folk should replace them. But in my personal opinion, we have to look at this through the lens of that particular era. when socialism and communism were on the rise. This was in the early 1900s, 1907, 1908, a few years before the Bolshevik Revolution. So people were, as unfortunately they are today, kinda against intellectuals, specialists, people who actually know what they're talking about. How did and still do oligarchs come to power? In modern days, the easiest way to have yourself an oligarchy is by having a few individuals buy state properties and assets and exploit them for profit, or simply slowly build up a monopoly over certain businesses and or resources. This wealth is then used to ascend to higher positions and eventually buy political influence. Once access to power is gained, the wealth is leveraged to serve the oligarch's interests. A well-placed loan here, gulping up another business there, granting a productive contract to someone important, donating to a noble cause, you name it. Of course, all of this comes with a price tag, more power to the oligarchs. Eventually, as history shows us, oligarchs split the market and resources between them. They stay out of each other's way and eventually form alliances, although shadow alliances. This leads to aligning their goals and eventually deciding the direction of a country. Well, doesn't that sound very encouraging? What kind of power do oligarchs have? Well, usually oligarchs rule from the shadow. It's better and easier for them to not be the face of power, so they don't lose their influence, their power, they are not blamed for things that are going wrong. Better have somebody else take the fall. And this also grants them plausible deniability. It wasn't me. I just donated to a campaign, or I just tried to prop up the market. It's better to have very receptive people in power, people over whom they have influence. This is why we come full circle to what I mentioned earlier. Corruption, they bribe, they blackmail, they threaten, and once politicians are in their pockets, they are free to expand their monopolies and gain even more power. On the flip side, if enough time has passed and a sturdy oligarchy has been established, even the person in power is usually one of them. This means that they have a very fragile power, because if they oppose the chief oligarch, that individual is actually in control of the very corrupt state that they helped build and the very corrupt military that they kind of built. Meaning that they might end up falling from very tall buildings or stop enjoying tea altogether. This has been known to happen, surprisingly enough. Usually oligarchs in states that have a strong ruling body are more discreet and are happy to simply pump billions in lobbyists and buying politicians. But overall, the vast majority of examples are of an oppressive, coercive ruling through fear and deprivation, by controlling resources so that the population has little to no chance of revolting because of being in a constant survival mode and always being suspicious of one another. Divide et impera. In an oligarchy, who do the oligarchs listen to? This depends on the time and space we are talking about, but because most full-blown oligarchies have been established more recently in the past 30-40 years, it is quite easy to answer this question when talking about modern-day oligarchies. They listen to one another. They listen to other oligarchs and individuals who were put in place because it would benefit the oligarchs. This could mean relatives, yes men and yes women, and even in some weird cases, specialists. At the end of the day, they will listen to anyone who makes them more money and offer them even more power and influence. It's as simple as that. Are oligarchies good or bad? I am sure you are wondering this by this point. The answer is that initially they are neither. They are neutral. But with the passage of time, oligarchs want more and more power, as is expected, and eventually they stop ruling for everybody's benefit and they stop hiding their true intent and start ruling for their own benefits at the expense of everyone else. They end up being like a tick or like a virus. As time passes, they multiply or get fatter, and the host body, in this case the country, becomes more and more ill until something snaps. It's hard to predict what happens in the case of something snapping and people having enough, as it hasn't often happened actually, but we'll see what history brings. The best known oligarch in ancient history. There is one individual who is the perfect embodiment of an oligarch, and he comes from the ancient Roman times. This individual began his career as commander in Lucius Cornelius Sulla's army during the civil war against Gaius Marius, the creator of the Roman army as we know it. But that's another story for another time. Anyway, the individual we are talking about emerged as a fairly competent commander during the civil war and later defeated Spartacus and his troops during the slave revolts, also known as the Servile War or the Gladiator War in 71 BCE, thus ending the revolt. Once Sulla became dictator, this individual used his position and proximity to power to become one of the richest people in history, and his name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Initially, he amassed a hefty sum of money through his military career, and then he multiplied that chunk of money through proscriptions, meaning that the properties and assets of political enemies of Sulla, his commanding officer, were auctioned off very cheaply. Crassus made efforts, and using the money from spoils he gained as a military man, brought properties. Using these spoils, he also brought slaves, a silver mine or two, and properties that he rented out, and then even more properties that burned down and rebuilt using his slave labor. He then went on to buy more slaves that were highly trained architects and builders, craftsmen of all kinds, so nothing really outrageous for that particular era. But here comes the fun part. He used a fairly interesting and outright evil method of enriching himself. He created the first Roman fire brigade of 500 people strong. This was of course initially applauded by the citizens of Rome who were in dire need of a fire brigade. That is until the first fire actually broke out. Upon reaching the scene, the fire brigade would not intervene to put out the fire, while Crassus offered to buy the burning property from the owner at a pitiful price. In desperation, the owners agreed, and once the deal was sealed, the fire brigade would intervene and put the fire out. If the owners refused, on the other hand, the fire brigade and Crassus would stand by and watch the pretty flames go up and up. Crassus would offer an even lower price for the now smoking ruin of the property and would usually get a deal. People were desperate. Once the property was bought, he would rebuild it, and then Crassus would rent it back to the original owner or to new tenants if the original owner wasn't in the mood anymore. He ended up owning much of Rome in this way, as fires were almost a daily occurrence in the ancient city, mostly built of wood. Oh, and the fire brigade services were also not for free, as far as I remember. Now, what is interesting about Crassus is that ancient sources mention that he did not throw lavish parties. On the contrary, the meals he ate at home with his family were decent but nothing fancy, and during parties the food would be generous but nothing luxurious. He surrounded himself with good and loyal friends, but also with individuals who were politically useful. He used his wealth to influence and gain fame, and as a launchpad for his political career, and he became the unofficial patron and supporter of Caesar, supporting his political and military career. He was elected consul alongside Pompey Magnus, and they became rivals. Against Spartacus, he trained and equipped new troops out of his own pocket, which was really expensive. And he revived the practice of decimation, having the soldiers kill one of 10 comrades chosen by lot after some of the troops deserted. He thus demonstrated to the troops that he was more dangerous than the enemy, according to Plutarch. He was part of the first triumvirate that led Rome, made up of Pompey Magnus, Caius, Caesar, and himself. In 56 BCE, he was named governor of Syria, and in 53 BCE, he sought to gain even more fame and equal that of Caesar and Pompey by crossing the Euphrates with the intention of conquering Parthia. Nothing nothing too difficult, right? He died as a parley party was assembled to negotiate the Roman surrender and return to their own territories after some very brutal defeats. His body was desecrated by the Parthians by having liquid gold poured into his mouth as a symbol of his greed during his life. He was by all definitions a full-fledged oligarch of the ancient Roman Republic. Oligarchs and their subjects. As I mentioned earlier, even if initially oligarchies are not outright evil, they end up being deeply corrupted and flawed, resulting in the people suffering at the hands of oligarchs. Freedoms and liberties are abolished in all but name as to not pose a threat to the status quo. Resources are scarce and kept scarce. Poverty is quite noticeable. Day-to-day life is a constant state of survival, and corruption is promoted as the de facto policy of the state. Everyone is corrupted and everyone expects that those around them are corrupted, thus creating a hustle culture. Oligarchs exploit their subjects for their own gains with every decision made. Oligarchs then and now. In ancient times, when it comes to oligarchs and oligarchies, we only have isolated individuals here and there, like Crassus, and not oligarch-ran states. In medieval times we have guilds, and I think that, but this is just a personal opinion, that they are the precursors of actual oligarchies, with the best examples of some early oligarchies being the merchant states such as Florence and the maritime republics of Venice, Amalfi, and Genoa, Pisa, Ancona, Ragusa, and Noli. To be honest, this example might be a bit of a stretch, but hear me out. Their whole society revolved around trade and guilds, craftsmen and arts, with the guilds being very powerful and actually running the republics. And among the guilds, a handful of families running everything, families such as the Medici, who, if I'm not mistaken, even gave a pope or two. They controlled the Mediterranean for a long while, established colonies around the Mediterranean, took on the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and were kinda successful. So, you tell me they weren't oligarchies. But nowadays we do have very clear examples of oligarchs and oligarchies throughout the world. From families who run big pharma to alliances between corporations to divide among themselves and control whole industries, and even full-fledged oligarch-run states. Examples of modern-day oligarchies. The best known example in the world at this point is Russia, where oil, gas and metal works oligarchs have slowly amassed power and influence since the fall of the Soviet Union by buying whole industries during the Great Privatization at the beginning of the 1990s. But they aren't the only ones. On our list, we also have China, where a few individuals have held power for decades. We have Iran, where we have a religious oligarchy. We even have Ukraine, but before the war, where we had a business oligarchy. And there are some indications that the US of A is sometimes flirting with oligarchs. But before you throw tomatoes at me, think about it. Lobbyists protect whose interests? There is Big Pharma, Big Oil, Wall Street, and so many more individuals. And of course, depending on who's in power, these lobbyists have more or less sway. I might be wrong, but we all know I'm not. How to use all we learned today in your world building. In my opinion, have an oligarchy that is still playing nice, reach out to the party and offer to sponsor them in exchange for certain services. Or have a group of very wealthy and influential individuals offer to be patrons in exchange for help in overthrowing a ruthless leader, and then have them slowly fall to corruption and petty squabbles that leave the country in ruin. Have the party be part of a revolution against an oligarchy and install a benevolent ruler to rebuild and bring prosperity. Oh, and by all means, make sure you throw a Crassus in the mix, as this will make for an awesome awesome plot twist, and he would make a terrific lieutenant for a BBEG. And with that, if you enjoyed this video and found value in it, please make sure you like, as this shows me it was useful to you. Make sure you subscribe and join this growing, wonderful, funky community. And don't forget to hit the bell so you are notified when the next video is out. And if you want to take your help to the next level, make sure you share this video with your friends, your DMs, your GMs, your storytellers, writers, creators, players, neighbors, candle keepers, family, pets, everyone. Oh, and don't forget to comment down below on how you would use or are currently using oligarchies in your world. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope you found some inspiration and learned something new today, and I can't wait to see you all funky people here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your dose of sometimes miniature painting, history, world building, and even trivia. Remember, be curious, take inspiration from the past, and never stop learning, world building, and creating amazing things, whatever those are. Your mind and imagination are awesome, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Until next time, have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful, funky day. Cheers.